My name is Malebo Sipodi. I'm a South African joining you from Oldenburg, Germany. I am here for a short fellowship, and I am the moderator for today's digital dialogue. For the benefit of participants who are blind or have visual impairment, all speakers will begin with a short description. I'm a Black woman, and I am wearing a red I'm wearing a red duke. That's how we call it in South Africa. It's the English word is leaving me. I'm wearing a red duke, and I'm wearing glasses with red frames, and I have red lipstick. Digital Dialogues is a series of panel discussions exploring civil society perspectives on the emerging digital world. Today's discussion topic is artificial intelligence slash AI in conflict. Conflict, i.e., the active pursuit of different interests, is a normal part of everyday life in all societies. Conflicts take many forms, ranging from differences of opinion to disagreements and disputes. Constructive and respectful behavior can resolve conflicts and calm a situation. However, conflicts can also escalate and lead to the deliberate use of violent forms of expressions, both as a protest against and as an assertion of prevailing systems of power. Conflicts escalate into serious and prolonged, sometimes structural violence when methods and technologies are used that do not resolve the conflict, and at least one side, perhaps more, deliberately causes harm and suffering that is not disproportionate or unrelated to the original issue, but also violates universal human rights, values, and standards. Often, power imbalances result in violence that significantly harms and oppresses the weaker opponents. Given that technology has always been part of conflict, be it in communication, propaganda, mobilization, and violence, the arrival of artificial intelligence does not fundamentally change the situation. However, it is believed that artificial intelligence can be used in a number of ways that can encourage repression and violence and make it more effective. Weaker parties may find it more difficult to fight an opponent equipped with AI tools. Zora Neale Hurston, in her quote, says, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer. However argued, the questions posed or answers brought forward have a monumental impact on the world's future, an imperative framing as we go into this dialogue." To help us discuss these issues and more, we are delighted to welcome to the panel today my colleagues, Dr. Mugamba Laibuta, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and who is the chairperson of Data Privacy and Governance Society of Kenya. We also have Alexi Drew, who is a technology policy advisor at the ICRC based in London. And we have Dr. Matt Mahmoudi, who is a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International and was the lead author of the Automated Apartheid Report. Their bios will be made available to you so you can read more on what they've done, the work that they've done, and why it is that we've invited them to help us with this discussion. To start us off today, each panelist will introduce themselves and frame the issue by sharing the current landscape and their key points for around 5 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion and questions. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. We won't get to all of them, but we'll certainly try. Mugambi, would you please turn on your camera and join me here? Dr. Mugambi is joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. Please introduce yourself and share your key points, but don't forget to start with a brief self-description. Welcome, Dr. Mugambi.
Hey, thank you, Malebo. I trust you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, so self-description. So black male with spectacles, quite large. I go to the gym, so I try to say that I have some muscles. So I hope they are visible here and there. But so I'm going to start. So when we talk about AI in conflict, I've actually done some research on surveillance, the state of digital surveillance in East Africa, focusing on Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And a report has been published by Paradigm Initiative, and you can get the report on their website. So before we talk about AI in conflict situation, there's usually a background as to how we get here. And in East Africa, for example, we do have several laws that allow for surveillance. For example, the laws in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda provide for certain state agents and give them the power to do what mostly people call national security. And of course, we know this national security is not really well defined, and some countries define national security broadly. That at times also includes taking action against civil society actors, against political opponents, or just dissidents against the state. So when you look at the constitutions of these four countries, they also have certain rights. They have the right to freedom of expression, they have a right to freedom of movement, the right to privacy, the right to dignity, etc. But then because this constitution set out to establish these national security organs, the national security organs mostly is the police, the intelligence service, and the armed forces, is that they give them power to carry out certain forms of surveillance. And mostly these agents are usually exempted from certain fundamental rights and freedoms. Some of it is blanket, someone is not. And because of this, these states in the four countries have set out certain technologies for surveillance. Some may not look in strict sense as surveillance, but they provide the platform from which public and private data may be extracted for use, for example, to train AI system, to carry out mass surveillance or to carry out targeted surveillance for purposes of national security or for purposes of investigations, public health, etc. So you'll find in these countries, there is, of course, there's a big push for digital ID systems. There's digital ID in Kenya, Uganda has been pushing for it, and of course, Rwanda, I think it's a big proposal in Tanzania, and I think it will come to fruition soon. We have public CCTV system, and under the big, what we call smart cities initiatives. There's also initiatives, for example, for number plate readers. You'll find them in Kenya. We have number plate readers. In Uganda, they're setting up that system, and there's communication surveillance. And this communication surveillance is carried out mostly by the police and the National Intelligence Service. And also to remember that anti-terror laws in Kenya, in the four East African countries I've mentioned, usually provide for some quite blanket surveillance strategies or surveillance initiatives. And you'll find there are harms to this because in these countries, I mean, you'll find that so use of technologies from companies such as Huawei, technologies such as Circles and Pegasus, have been used for both legitimate and illegitimate national security purposes. You look at it, for example, there was a report done by Privacy International a few years back that indicates such a communication technology was used in Kenya to target people who are really said to be anti-terror suspects, and some of these suspects actually experienced extrajudicial. I mean, they were killed extrajudicially, and they say that the data to apprehend them was from this technology. In Uganda, it said that some of this technology, communication surveillance, was used to target dissidents or political opponents. The same has been said of Rwanda, but there's no real data about whether such technologies, communication surveillance technologies, have been used in Tanzania. So all this just indicates the role of data that is available for surveillance technology, whether through CCTV, ID systems, revenue authority system, number plate readers, or communication surveillance. It provides this host of data that can be used to train AI systems. Of course, now we are not in a conflict situation, so there's no real data as to whether AI systems are going to be used in AI technology or similar technology is going to be used in conflict situation within this region. But I think the stage is set in that we have laws, we have constitutions, we have laws, we have technology and data available that potentially could be used to train, that is actually perhaps being used to train AI systems, or could be used in the future. So as I said, I think this just shows that, and I think my colleagues will talk, I think Mark will talk about perhaps AI in real conflict systems, and will indicate how we move from the data, the public and private data available that is used to train AIs, and the technology that is available that now AI is used to target individuals through, a very overt conflict situation. Thank you so much, Malebo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laibuta. I mean, it's interesting that you bring the Africa perspective, particularly East Africa. And I'm actually quite curious to see how it links with the rest of the panelists in the conversation, because there's always this talk about, particularly in Africa, that we need to catch up with AI systems. And when we say we do not have conflict, what do we actually mean? But I don't want to pose any question now. We will get back to this as we thread it with the other panelists. And right now we are going to ask Dr. Matt to come on screen and introduce themselves, tell us where they're tuning from, and don't forget a self-description, and we look forward to your points.
Thank you so much, Malebo, and Dr. Laibuta for the comments before. I am Matt Mahmoudi. I am a brown man with also fairly sizable spectacles and chaotically long hair is, I think, the best way I can describe it. Apologies to the BSL interpreters. I focus on the automation of apartheid, for a lack of better expression. I've been looking at the ways in which AI-driven surveillance systems have been used to reinforce aspects of apartheid in the context of the occupied Palestinian territories. Ordinarily, my remit includes looking at other forms of AI-driven surveillance systems and their usage by law enforcement, as well as in military contexts. Now, in the context of the occupied territories, experimentation with and the development of surveillance tools on Palestinian communities is not new. As some of you might be aware, it goes back to the post-1948 period of the Israeli military intelligence operations that took place in an effort to originally map out Palestinian communities. And of course, we had early attempts at trying to create a computationally run biometric infrastructure to support the apartheid that took place in South Africa as well, though the aspirations to create such a centralized form of a biometric segregation system never reached its full potential, purely as a result of the constraints of technological advancement at the time. However, since the end of the 20th century, Israeli efforts have been animated by quite a rapid development of biometric technologies and data-intensive computing capabilities that have allowed it to really take some of our worst nightmares and techno-dystopian fantasies and make them real. And the ways in which we've seen that play out has been through the usage of various forms of AI systems, and in particular, facial recognition systems. For those of you who are uninitiated, at Amnesty, we have the position that facial recognition systems are fundamentally incompatible with international human rights law. We hold this because facial recognition technologies rely on the widespread bulk scraping of people's images from places like social media without their knowledge and consent. And because the technology itself depends on the action that I've described before, it is incompatible with the right to privacy, because that function is fundamentally mass surveillance, which we consider disproportional, unnecessary, and illegitimate. We know that facial recognition technologies violate the right to equality and non-discrimination because of the ways that the technology both has technical biases that are presenting false positives for, in particular, Black and brown people, and in particular, Black women, meaning that they often lead to false arrests, but also because the systems tend to be deployed in racially discriminatory contexts around communities of color and against communities of color. And we also hold that they're fundamentally incompatible with the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly because of the chilling effect that they come with. And people are less likely to engage in their freedoms, their right to protest, if they know that they're going to be identified simply for dissenting. Now, taking that into account, we also now know that the ways in which these systems are being used in the occupied Palestinian territories reinforce aspects of apartheid. And specifically, those aspects are: one, the reinforcement of unlawful restrictions on the freedom of movement; two, to perpetuate a coercive environment that is intended to force Palestinians out of areas of strategic interest to Israeli authorities. So in checkpoints in the West Bank, you'll know of a recent facial recognition program called Red Wolf, which scans Palestinian faces and adds them to vast databases which are used to intensify surveillance and the draconian closure regime that the State of Israel already imposes on Palestinians in Hebron. And Palestinians now rely on a computer system, an algorithm identifying them in order to move within and between their communities to access basic things like grocery stores, medical support, and education. Whereas previously they were relying on a soldier knowing them. And we're hearing reports of how even when the soldier knows the individual that is passing through the checkpoint, if the computer says no, they are more likely to rely on that information than their own intuition. So again, you see a digital form of dehumanization of Palestinians that is also taking place. We know of the Blue Wolf system, which is the app that Israeli security forces are encouraged to use to capture as many Palestinian faces as possible, and they get rewarded for it. The more Palestinian faces have been captured by this app, the more rewards are available to the military unit that has engaged in the most amount of biometric captures. And basically, this is an attempt at creating a database, the largest database of Palestinian faces, to enable the smooth looking up of Palestinian faces for Israeli security forces. And we've seen this result in things like intelligence raids, where Israeli soldiers go to homes unsolicited, unannounced in the middle of the night, and pull out Palestinian families, line them up, and take images of them, even children, using the Blue Wolf app. We also know of the Mabat 2000 system, which is a 24/7 surveillance system that's used in East Jerusalem. It connects a vast array of cameras. There are about 1 to 2 cameras for every 5 meters walked in East Jerusalem, and it enables facial recognition across the old city. What it's also doing is that for communities that are resisting the capture of their homes and the demolition of their homes in places like Silwan in East Jerusalem, it's leading to a further coercive measure that is forcing Palestinians out of their own areas and their own neighborhoods out of fear that they might be captured for dissenting. And there's a global trade in these tools, right? Companies outside of Israel are providing the hardware and the cloud capabilities, the software, that together with Israelis' own developers is leading to the reinforcement of apartheid on Palestinians. We see this play out in Gaza as well, amongst other places, in which you will have heard of the Lavender system, the Gospel systems, the CoreSight facial recognition system, which are all being used by and large to slow down the movement of Palestinians from the north to the south in search of humanitarian aid. And in so doing, again, interfering with the right to freedom of movement and potentially making it even more difficult for Palestinians to survive this current unfolding genocide, as it's been designated by the International Court of Justice, this plausible genocide. Now I'm gonna stop there, and I'd love to get into this slightly more in the next round. But for now, those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. To those who've just joined us, please note that you can ask any questions, pop in the questions in the chat box at any time, and we will collate them and ask them to the panelists as we go through this conversation. We might not get through to all of your questions, but we will certainly try. Thank you so much, Matt, for bringing your pertinent points around the issue of surveillance in what's currently happening as we see in Palestine. And I hope that we'll be able to bring it together with our panelists today as when we get into the next section. And you touched on an important conversation and argument around surveillance and companies that actually drive these technologies, and what is the bottom line and what kind of consequences does it have on our world. Currently, we are going to ask Alexei to just go switch on their camera and introduce themselves. Alexei is currently in the United Kingdom and will then take us through their points. And please don't forget to begin with the self-description. Welcome, Alexei.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining me and the rest of us on this morning, afternoon or evening. I am a white woman. I'm currently wearing a very black t-shirt, which sets off my somewhat greying hair. It wasn't always grey, I promise. It's just the last couple of years. I'm going to try and talk about the same topic that we've just covered in the last two presentations, but on a kind of a grander 1,000 feet in the air scale, to look at some of the motivations or the justifications of some of the trends that our organization have been seeing, but some of you have already raised and are no doubt aware of as well. So effectively, what we want to grapple with is that in the last short period of time, even those of us who have been studying AI for a long time have noted a massive uptick in attention to artificial intelligence, as it's seemingly been presented as suddenly a mature system, suddenly something which is capable of delivering outcomes and outputs for states that they have previously not been able to achieve. It's offering to solve problems that have long existed and long tempted militaries and police forces that they have simply not been able to safely or effectively apply this tool to. However, with private sector offerings from a number of large companies rising to prominence and driving the marketing to suggest that these are the tools that can solve some of these pressing issues in the military domain, we're now seeing a rapid uptake. What I'd like to do is kind of unpack what those suggested benefits are that are driving this buy-in to artificial intelligence as a solution, and then to kind of cover off whether they are actually capable of offering those benefits that they are suggested to. So one of the most primary is that AI is demonstrated or suggested to be able to offer the maintenance of military advantage over your adversary in an armed conflict. That AI is effectively a way to ensure that those who already have the advantage, should it come to armed conflict, can maintain it. This goes in the other direction as well, that it is billed as an opportunity for those who have previously suffered on the other end of that spectrum of advantage to be able to regain the upper hand, or perhaps to compete with adversaries that previously or historically they have been unable to do so with. It's also been, in many cases, particularly when engaging with humanitarians like myself, been posited that AI tools such as weapon systems or decision support systems that help military operators make choices in armed conflicts are actually a means of being safer and providing safer and more secure outcomes for both militaries and civilians impacted by this armed conflict. And finally, there's a lot of suggestion that these tools are allowing militaries and states to finally gain the benefit from the vast amount of data that they have collected from the private sector markets or from their own collection of surveillance tools, legal and otherwise. So it's a very attractive prospect to militaries to be offered this very shiny carrot from a large number of, and a growing number of, private sector companies that are trying to move into this area and offer tools that can be useful to armed forces, not just in the global majority, but also in the global minority. Now, the question that we should really ask ourselves, however, those who have been studying AI for a longer period of time, and those of us who are likely to find ourselves forced to confront the international humanitarian law realities, the ethics, and the harm that could be caused by new military tools is this marketing spiel, this offer that is used to make these tools very attractive, actually accurate with regards to what can be delivered? Does the hype meet reality? And the answer is, in many cases, no. And in some cases, the reality that's delivered actually has or will have the opposite effect. So, for example, if we look on the concept of providing an advantage, military advantage, to those who have previously not held it by being outclassed by their peers. Well, unfortunately, as is mentioned by some of the previous panelists, a lot of the tools and resources that go into developing these technologies, these artificial intelligence tools, they still rest with a very small number of companies, organizations, and state actors that are already in a position of relative power over their peers. They are very unlikely to allow for that balance to be redressed through the democratization or proliferation of tools that would see their prime beneficiaries, their host nations, brought to either equal footing or certainly not a lesser footing than the companies or the places they're trying to market these tools into. So that's already unlikely to be the case. Now, when it comes to the concept of speed, which is commonly used as a justification, that military advantage is maintained by being able to act faster than your opponents. Now, yes, artificial intelligence can process information at a much greater pace than a human operator. So you can use less human resource to deliver faster outcomes. But by removing that human component, you're actually removing a necessary and in many cases ethical slowdown in the pace of making military decisions. Because without that human component that slows down that decision, you're removing the ability to ensure that the outcome you're going to reach is ethical, is actually safe, and in the case of law, is actually in keeping with your requirements of international humanitarian law. So speed is effectively smoke and mirrors. It's billed as this large and attractive concept that militaries are almost naturally attracted towards achieving. However, in achieving it, you effectively undermine what should be a significant feature of any military action, which is the protection of civilians from harm. Now, another area which is effectively poorly framed and inaccurately portrayed is that AI is capable of doing things in a more predictable manner, and the fact that we can understand the outputs that are developed. Now, in reality, the nature of many of the artificial intelligence tools that we're seeing already delivered into operational contexts, such as battlefields and armed conflicts around the world, are not easier to understand than human decision makers. They're actually a lot harder. And that means that we can't be sure that the decisions that are being made are always going to have the outcomes we intend them to. These are systems that in many cases are eventually intended to be placed in an operational theatre and allowed to make decisions based upon their surroundings with minimal human input. Now, that would be fine, potentially, if we were able to fully predict what that system would do in every possible scenario that they would face. But fundamentally, one, armed conflicts and battlefields are some of the most complicated environments on a planet. Two, simply put, the way that these tools are trained are not able to be understood and questioned and verified in the same way that you could inquire of a human operator, which means ensuring that there's accountability and verification and explainability after the fact, let alone prior to it, is nigh on impossible. And all of these together undermine the marketing and the hype cycle that is driving artificial intelligence more rapidly and more completely into modern armed conflict today. And I'll leave my points there and allow questions. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alexei. We will now move on to the second part of today's dialogue and provide the opportunity for the speakers to ask questions to one another based on their opening inputs. And it's just listening to all the speakers, there are points that really have stood out, particularly the issue of power imbalance and this idea of AI as a race to global dominance and who has most power and access, and what that means when we talk about conflict, when we talk about war, and the issue of surveillance technology, when we think about advanced image processing systems, and the kind of systems that have been used throughout conflicts in the past, when we look at the Black BLM movements and the policing, and how surveillance technology has been used and how problematic that has been, but now used on a different scale, and the kind of gross issues that we are dealt with today, issues of ethics of data collection and how data is collected, particularly historic data. And you know, Matt spoke about the surveillance of Palestinians in occupied territory and how the movements are registered, and how the facial images and biometrics are used against a certain set of data, and how targets are then brought to forth. And then when we think about Alexei talking about faster war fighting, and there's many arguments around, is that going to lead to global security and peace? And then we have companies who drive these tools, and they're thinking about the economic bottom line, but really, what does that mean in the bigger picture? And then thank you to Laibuta, Dr. Laibuta, who brought in Africa and the idea of how Africa is trying to catch up, and then what does that mean for conflicts? And many times, what does fake news mean for conflicts? We've seen it arise in Africa, the kind of narrative that is in the media. These are pertinent conversations that have come up from our panelists, and now, and as we can see, there's a thread, and we bring it in this global stage, in this conversation where all of us are here. And if you have any questions, please do place them in the chat box. But now I'm going to open up for our panelists to speak to each other, to ask each other questions, and so that we can lead on. And then from then onwards, I will take questions from the audience that is joining us today. I'm opening it up to our panelists. Please do, thank you for turning on your cameras, and please do continue asking, please do ask each other questions, and tease out the relationships and intersections in the current landscapes and in your work. Thank you so much. We can start with anybody. Who would like to start? Matt, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Malebo. So we've learned of systems like the Lavender system within the context of Gaza that draws up lists of thousands and thousands of Palestinians based on unlawfully obtained data and biased data sets to often AI wash and justify the collective punishment of Palestinians as somehow targeted, as somehow contingent on logics beyond indiscriminate killings, which is really what we've been seeing coming out of Gaza. Now, I want to get back to the conversation that Alexei started around meaningful human control. And I think meaningful human control, certainly when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, is something that's, that we need to touch on and we need to talk about, but also conscious that systems like Lavender really aren't per se autonomous weapon systems, but they're really more akin to something like predictive policing. They draw up lists that are, falsely pretending to be accurate and legitimate. Again, when you have 37,000 targets being drawn up by an AI system, you really should pause to think. And I'd be curious about your sense of whether there is ever any amount of human control of such a system that would justify it or legitimize it in its usage in warfare. Because with that case, I think there was, in fact, some amount of human control and decision-making that was required. But I'm conscious that, no matter what we get to as far as, whether it's 20 seconds or 5 minutes or an hour, those systems remain built in these, potentially problematic ways. And I'd love your reflections on it as well.
That's a great question. I think there's a good way of categorizing some of the two, there's probably more, but broadly speaking, two types of use of AI in armed conflict that both have this dynamic of meaningful human control as a crucial element of avoidance of risk and harm and legality. One of which is, as you've already mentioned, autonomous weapon systems. Like, we're all aware of, anyone who's worked in this has probably come across them enough times by this point. But there is a category which is often overlooked, which is what we're kind of touching on here. And we would call them decision support systems, right? The idea that it's an AI tool of some type, generally will process huge amounts of data, which is meant to then present options or potential actions to, in our case, military stakeholders or actors or individuals in the armed services. Now, the problem we face here that's relatively unique, somewhat different to the meaningful human control conundrum of autonomous weapon systems, is that the scale of the type of data and the scale of it is not the same, which means that the processes or doctrine or controls you might have put in place to ensure that an operator of an autonomous weapon system has meaningful human control, i.e. they understand the inputs versus the outputs and how decisions and those are controlled, is vastly different from how the same operator would have to try and understand a decision support system. And that's before you get to the component, as you rightly touched on, is that it's that bit where the human machine overlaps that is where you either can create good, meaningful and effective, meaningful human control, or you can undermine it. And it's also, the other thing to bear in mind is it's not a single point in time in which that meaningful human control is created and then it's static. It can change over time because it's the nature of psychology. So that's the human bit of the human machine overlap. So for example, it's about trust. I might trust a machine because I think I understand well enough to be critical of the decisions it's suggesting to me. Whether I do or not, different question. But do I maintain that level of sufficient critique and ability to critique it over time? Or does that change depending on the scenario in which I'm facing, the orders and the pressures and psychological pressure that I'm under? Or does that actually degrade my ability to question the options being presented to me? And those are all the kinds of problems, the human machine teaming problems, that have not yet been sufficiently answered with regards to how do we actually create a process, a doctrine and a technology from the design stage that can actually be ensuring that civilians are protected from harm and these tools are not misused. And that, I think, it's a really complex question, and we have definitely not answered it. And we're increasingly seeing this hype cycle is reducing the amount of time that we have to answer it and then act upon those questions.
Mugambi, you can come in.
Okay, thank you. So I think mine is to Matt. So you find that automated decision making finds its way in a lot of data protection laws across the African continent. There'll be a provision that says you can't carry out automated decision making without consulting the data subjects. You need to carry out a risk assessment. So that's as much as we have that relates to that. But my question basically is on AI regulation, because you talk about the Palestinian, the Palestinian genocide situation. And you find that in Africa, what is happening now, there are quite a number of countries that are discussing AI laws. But there's also a push from a lot of multinational vendors to water down these laws. So you'll find in some countries is the question, do we regulate AI the way we have an AI Act in the EU? And a lot of, so you find a lot of big tech are pushing and saying, no, in Africa, let's have a strategy, or let's have a policy, or let's just have some principles. And so my question, how did this pan out within the Palestinian situation? Because what I see that will potentially happen in Africa is that, of course, we will have a fragmented AI regulation system in as much as we have the African Union Digital Trade Protocol, and we have annexes that talk about these technologies, but with a push by a lot of these vendors to have watered down regulations, then it just means that all this data that we are talking about will be available to all. So how do we deal with this kind of situation? Because I don't see any country in Africa in the foreseeable future having a law that is similar to what we have in the AU that also has completely restricted AI technologies.
Thank you, Mugambi. Really appreciate it. Those are great questions. I will start by saying that even in the context of the EU, with the EU AI Act, there was significant lobbying taking place by multinationals who obviously wanted to bring their product to market. And what was quite interesting even there is that there are significant carve-outs within the EU AI Act that currently allows for the deployment of even the technologies that are on the prohibited or on the high risk list, insofar as national security interests are at stakes. So if you think about that situation, you'll see that actually in the very cases that we're trying to protect folks against those tools being used, for example, against migrants or refugees or asylum seekers that are attempting to get to the EU, or people who are protesting and who are political dissidents, they are the very people that these tools are still rubber stamped to be used against because of the significant carve-outs under national security exemptions that do exist. And in the same way, so that creates a fragmented, as you rightly pointed to, fragmented and fractured AI regulation regime. That exists within the context of the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel as well. In 2019, the Israeli National Cyber Security Directorate published a report in which they clearly laid out that facial recognition systems were incompatible with civil liberties in Israel. And so they recommended that the system be prohibited, or at the very least that a moratorium put in place. And so we have a situation in which a government body has decided that facial recognition technology is incompatible with the rights of Israelis. And yet the technology is being used in laissez-faire ways against Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories by the occupying power. What's interesting there is, of course, that the occupying power also has a responsibility to Palestinians, the occupied, to guarantee their safety. Yet they're applying a double standard in which the tools that they're protecting their own citizens from are not being, the same protections are not being afforded to Palestinians. I don't actually see, as of now, any example of AI regulations or data protection regimes that ensures that there isn't a fragmented or fractured setup for people that occupy different privileges vis-a-vis citizenship status or immigration status or nationality. And I think that ultimately comes down to the fact that we have too much of a trigger-happy ethos when it comes to exemptions in general. And so I think if we want to build stronger AI regulation systems, we have to be better at not drawing carve-outs for systems that we believe are so detestable that we would put them on a prohibited list to begin with. And so I think if you hold that these systems are incompatible with international humanitarian law and with international human rights law, then there shouldn't really be any carve-outs for the usage, period. And I think that's where we need to get to. But unfortunately, I don't think that's a reality in the policy landscape that we've witnessed anywhere. And yeah, I think that's a global phenomenon which you're pointing to there, Mugambi, in terms of the pressures corporations to water down those regulatory frameworks.
Thank you so much, Matt. Alexi, I see your hand just quickly, and then because we need to move on to the questions, but I think everything is quite...
A very quick point. Yeah. Then I think the other difficulty we're struggling with regards to regulation is that if you look at the resource, or one of the key resources behind artificial intelligence, data, right? It's gone through several stages of how data is interpreted and engaged with in governance over the last 15 to 20 years. There was a complete period of laissez-faire where data is just spread globally without really much control or governance or any legal clarification as to ownership, privacy concerns, whatever. There's been a period where actually certain areas with kind of large extraterritorial powers with regards to governance have managed to wind that back to protect select citizens. So GDPR being an example of that, data transference laws, etc., and sovereign data. The problem is that is very much limited to those who already have that power, that access, that dynamic. And what you will see is that even if that were to spread globally, that states and unions such as the AU create their own GDPR-esque data privacy ownership normal standardization, there will be the same categories as always: sitting between those gaps because we haven't reached that point of fundamental data ownership and privacy for everyone, irrespective of position in society. And that's the bit we're missing.
Thank you so much. And Alexei, you did mention the issue of predictability and AI. And I think if I look at most of the questions that have come in when we think about AI does not produce facts, but prediction as many would have it. But then when you think about the quality and validity of this intelligence, what is the probability? I'll pose this question to Matt. This question has come up quite a bit in terms of how can civil society effectively harness the benefits of AI to promote peace and justice while mitigating its potential for abuse in surveillance, repression, and militarized conflict. So this is one of the questions that come from the audience, but I think it encapsulates a lot of the questions that come in, like, can AI bring about peace? Can AI bring about solution? Is AI the way to go? Can we catch up? And I know that you and Alexei did touch on this on a very sophisticated level, but just a quick point on, is AI the solution? Can it bring peace, and how does it then bring peace? I'll give it over to Matt.
Thank you so much, Malebo. So I think going back slightly to what Alexei said before, I think AI is a marketing term, and we have to appreciate that there have been a number of different words that have been used over the last 3-4 decades to describe, anywhere from fairly simple statistical methods right over to the more sophisticated natural language processing and now large language models. And everything at different moments has had a term that has given it economic credence to the point where you could do some amount of speculation about what AI will be able to do tomorrow or the day after or 10 years later to drive up the profit margins of the companies that are developing these products. Examples include, in the early 90s, it was the question of ICTs for development, information communication technologies for development and for human rights. In the 2000s and the 2010s, it was about social media for democracy. In the 2010s, it also became, apps for democracy, various different apps that were going to help us solve all of the problems in the world. There was an app for that, was the narrative that was being used. Then we moved over into the tech for development, and generally speaking, tech for human rights and tech, which is a field that I'm allegedly still in. And then we come to AI in this moment. And ultimately, what I think is interesting and what we need to pay attention to is the fact that most of the products that are actually being sold to us as enabling of the solutions that we're looking for oftentimes don't even work according to the way that they specify themselves. I was recently at a technology exposition in New Jersey in which a tool by a particular company that was alleging to be able to do gender detection was detecting various different genders that people didn't identify with on the premise that, the system was still being developed. And for the time being, it was using the proxy of people's hair length and height as a proxy for their gender, which of course is bogus. Again, and that really just goes to the core of the bogus of trying to identify gender in the first place. But to make a machine learning algorithm do it is fundamentally problematic and flawed. But their callback was, listen, we will be able to do this in 5 to 10 years. You should buy into the system now. And I think that's fundamentally what we need to keep in mind as we're trying to think of whether AI can solve these problems. It's not about whether AI can solve these problems. It's about whether a particular discrete technology that you're looking for that meets the needs that you're trying to solve can do so. So rather than asking, how can AI come in and be the miracle cure for disease, for planetary degradation, environmental collapse, it's the planet is collapsing. What do we need to do? We need to reduce emissions and we need to fundamentally transform our economy. Is that compatible with the kinds of high emitting AI systems and data centers that we currently have in place? I think the answer to that is probably no. And so that at least forecloses particular systems. But then the question becomes, what are the ways in which we can spread awareness and change policy to that effect? And it becomes a more techno-agnostic question. I think that's what we have to get to. So I'm sorry, Malebo, for not giving you a straightforward answer, but I think really the answer is AI isn't a panacea, and we are risking moving into this techno-solutionist narrative, right? So
yeah. And it's interesting how you speak about how these these companies who drive these technologies will promise, but at the end of the day, what is delivered? It makes me think about also the pre-existing tools, that have been created in other circumstances and how they are used in conflict, i.e. the kind of data that's collected through digital ID and now used in surveillance technology. Dr. Mugambi, I see your hand, but there is a question that I want to pose to you, so you can add to this and link it to answering this question. So the question is from George William. It says, considering the expanded definition of crime in Uganda to include actions such as joining small political protests or tweeting at politicians, and the broad laws around misuse of social media and sharing malicious information that give authorities additional power to silence critics, how can privacy rights be effectively enforced in such environments? Dr. Mugambi?
That's an interesting one, because in Uganda, I think this is a bit of a challenge because we've seen our colleagues in Uganda have actually had to go to the East African Court of Justice, where certain fundamental rights and freedoms have been infringed. For example, when there was the internet shutdown during the last election, they felt that they could not find any effective remedies within the local courts, so they went to the East African Court of Justice. Of course, there's the Data Protection Commissioner. There's a Data Protection Authority in Uganda that is set up under the Data Protection, the Personal Data Protection Act. But then the question is, to what extent will the Data Commissioner handle issues like these privacy issues or data protection issues that lean very much towards political issues? I think that's I mean, in the recent NADPA conference, there was a conference in Nairobi for the National Association of Privacy Data Protection Authorities in Africa. And this was really an interesting question, the independence and the potential for these authorities to deal with these privacy or data protection issues that have a political connotation to it. So really what I'm saying, there's really no straight answer to this. They are the Ugandan courts, there's the Data Protection Authority, but mostly in such issues, people go to the East African Court of Justice, which of course the Ugandan government will ignore where a decision is made that it has gone against the constitution. So what I wanted to add in what Matt was saying, I hope that answers that question. What I wanted to add what Matt was saying. So in our research, what we realize is that what technology firms, when they're providing technology to African countries, they provide these AI tools as something that the governments can test. It's like a freebie. It's like buy one, get one free. So they buy, like, for example, CCTV systems, or number plate readers, or IDs, digital ID system, and they get a tool which they are given to test. And what this testing means is just mopping out the data that is available in the public and private domain, especially from the public databases. Because you see, for public databases, you have ID, you have immigration, you have hospital, your education, etc. So at the end of the day, as Matt was saying, so I say you will need this in the future. So have it, buy it, and actually sometimes it's not even bought. Like, use it for a while as we test it and see how it works in mopping out of this data. And I found that is something that has been happening across many African countries. There's this initiative called Smart Cities that is bringing a lot of surveillance, and who knows, at some point it will be used in very straight up conflict situation like is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Thank you so much. There are so many questions and so many thoughts, but this is an ongoing conversation. Don't forget to go on our social networks. The details are in the chat box, and please ask the panelists questions, and if they have time, they will come back to you on those questions. Unfortunately, I would love to take all the questions, but we can't. Thank you so much to all the panelists for joining us today. We appreciate your thoughts. We appreciate the time that you have made to come on here today. I would like to just give you a moment, because we have run out of time, and just give you a moment to give your final thoughts. And if you did see a question that you would have loved to touch on, just touch on it quickly, very, very, very quickly. I'd like to give Alexei, then Matt, and then Mugambi to close off. Your final thoughts.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. So one of the questions I get asked a lot is, rather than talking about what governments should or should not do, what should humanitarians and civil society organizations do with AI? My general first response to that is, first of all, ensure that the problem you're trying to solve is actually one which can be solved with AI, and there isn't another tool that can be used to solve it, because it's more likely then that you can understand and mitigate the risks of that, because we know them. And the next one is that try and solve problems which are actually collective rather than purely focused on one particular community or another. So environmental degradation and things like that. Those are the questions that these sorts of predictive tools might actually be able to help with and benefit everyone rather than just one small subset of the global community.
Thank you, Alexi. I guess I was next in line. So just to add basically what I just responded in the chat as well, which is to say, when governments and other actors are claiming to use AI systems to do X, Y, Z, what is actually being obfuscated? Is it neglect, or is it some other actions that are being taken behind the scenes that are being AI washed? What are the parts of a decision that go hidden and invisibilized as a result of the usage of the AI narrative? And I think we as the people, as communities of civil society organizations, have a duty to really expose the ways in which those very political decisions are being sanitized and hygienized via, again, this over-reliance on the AI narrative. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think for me, for academics and human rights practitioners, what is important is to carry out research and identify where some of these technologies are being deployed. Like has been presented in East Africa, for example, we are not yet here where AI is being deployed in a conflict situation, but the stage has already been set. The background data and the background technologies is already in place. Was this to happen? So, academics, human rights practitioners, we need to continue mapping out where these technologies are being applied, and it requires a lot of collaboration, because some like Circles and Pegasus, you really need technical experts to identify where they're being used. And also state actors, of course, need to understand what AI, I think even us as researchers, sometimes to explain what really AI is. And what technology we are talking about, because I think, as Matt said, it has become a buzzword, but we are not really able to explain what technologies we are talking about. And I think if we do this, and also monitoring the policies and legislations that are being discussed, because as I indicated, there's a lot of push to water down any initiative for regulation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And our esteemed audience echo my gratitude sentiments. Michael Borum says, applause as always to these excellent rockstar panelists. Thank you all for your ongoing work and efforts in the human rights sector. We are grateful for you. Thank you so much for joining us and for your thoughtful contributions. I personally have learned a lot. Thank you to our international sign interpreters and captioner for their great work. And thank you to our audience for joining us today and your insightful questions. And thank you to everyone who has been behind the scenes, making sure these dialogues